And so tonight we're going to have a look at the latter portion of Revelation chapter 14. Revelation 14, I think, is one of the most important chapters in terms of establishing not only the time spans involved in the events that we know are immediately in front of us, but the order of them as well. So tonight my objective is to set before you how I think that this chapter is extremely valuable to us in relation to timings and order of events. But there's a few things we need to understand about Revelation 14. And that is, it's broken into two parts. And there's like a fulcrum, you could say, in the middle of this chapter. So when you look at the chapter, you have a look at the breakup of it. Verses 1 to 5, which Brother Steve dealt with last time, the Lamb on Mount Zion with the redeemed, obviously sets forth a wonderful vision of the redeemed in the presence of Christ on Mount Zion, which means, of course, that that's post-Armageddon. That's after the battle of Armageddon. Verses 6 and 7 speak of the mid-heaven proclamation, which Steve spoke about a couple of weeks ago. Verse 8 about the destruction of Rome. Verses 9 to 11, a warning of judgment on the adherents of Catholicism. And then comes verse 12, which doesn't seem to fit. Verse 12 is about the patience of the saints. That's because, you see, verse 12 is like a fulcrum. The first half of the chapter deals with certain matters, as we've summarised. The second half of the chapter actually revisits the first half. But what it does for us is explain how the first half of the chapter came about. And that's a typical apocalyptic structure. You get the final vision, as it were, up front, and then you get the mechanics of how it comes about. So if you don't recognise that in chapter 14, you can get into all sorts of trouble. Now I want you to notice a couple of things. If you've got a highlighting pencil, I suggest you use it for this little exercise. It won't take you long. Do you notice the very first words of Revelation 14 are, "And I looked." So John is given this vision of the redeemed on Mount Zion. If you turn the page, you'll see in verse 14 the same words. "And I looked." In other words, that connects with verse 1. So when you go on to see the balance of this chapter, verses 13 to 16 are about Armageddon, the harvest of the earth. You'll immediately recognise that Armageddon has to actually come before the Lamb is seen on Mount Zion with the redeemed. The Lamb cannot be there with the redeemed until he has destroyed the oppressor of Israel, the Gogian host. So Armageddon has the phrase, "And I looked," is the clue to that. So we go back and we get an explanation of how this came about. Came about by the dramatic events of Armageddon, followed by 40 years of crushing judgments. I use that term with some point because it's about the crushing of the winepress. So the harvest of the earth is followed by the vintage of the earth. We're going to talk about that this evening. So the last part of the chapter, verses 17 to 20, deals with the vintage of the earth. If you want little evidence that this is right, just have a look at verse 13. So we've got in verse 12 reference to, "Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." Then it says in verse 13, "And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Write, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth." Now you'd think, wouldn't you, that if you'd had a vision about the redeemed being on Mount Zion in verse 1, that referring to the death of the saints now wouldn't necessarily be in harmony with that. But you see, what's happening here is you got this fulcrum in the middle, and John is being shown that this wonderful vision which stands before the believers was not going to be fulfilled until many of them, most of them in fact, all of them in his day, died. You got the vision. but you're going to die before it comes to pass. That's still happening, isn't it? There's been a lot of people who've seen this wonderful vision, but they've died. Blessed, he says, are they, that they may rest from their labours, that is, rest from their probationary labours. Why? Well, the end of verse 13 says, and their works do follow them. Now, Brother Thomas translates that, and their works, he goeth in aid with them. So you see, what he's talking about here is the fact that these people maintain their faith and their steadfastness in their probation is a guarantee that they will be there when these things come to pass. They're going to be involved in the works of establishing the kingdom of God. So there's incentive there, isn't there? You have visions, like John was given. See it clearly. But unless it affects your life, unless you live your life as though that is the greatest reality, unless you're prepared to give in service, you may not be involved in the works that are to come. For these people, he says, their works do follow them. They're going to have work in the age to come. So that's what he then says in verse 14, and I looked. So he steps us back to have a look how this comes to pass. Now that's a little secret in chapter 14 of the Apocalypse. You don't see that break. As they've got two parts to the chapter, you can get yourself into trouble. There's a few things that we just want to do to lead into this second half of chapter 14. The last vision that we saw in the Apocalypse was back in chapter 10, you will recall. It was about the triumph of the rainbowed angel. This is the next vision of glory in the Apocalypse. And it's very similar in a sense. You have a look at verse 14. I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, which is Christ's title as a judge, having on his head a golden crown, a Stephanos. So it's talking about personal victory, the victory of faith. And in his hand a sharp sickle, the instrument of divine judgment. So here we have a very similar vision to chapter 10. Because you see, Revelation 14 really is only an expansion of the vision of chapter 10. And where it fits in the scheme of things is like this. If you look at across the top of this chart, you'll get an idea of what it's about. We've got this red line here which refers to the resurrection of the dead and the judgment seat of Christ. We have a period of a preparation of the saints at the judgment seat. Then we have this red line of Armageddon, and then 40 years of judgment on the nations, culminating in the opening of the millennium. Then we have the millennium, and then we have beyond this red line the second resurrection and judgment, the time when God is all and in all. And when you look at all of the wonderful visions of the Apocalypse, they fit somewhere into that scheme of things. So you can start back in chapter 1, the vision of the multitudinous Christ. It basically covers the whole area. You've got the vision of chapter 4 and chapter 5. That's a reference to the period of divine judgment culminating in the establishment of the kingdom. You work down it, you got the vision of the rainbowed angel. It begins with the preparation of the saints. It does not end until the kingdom is established. When we see the rainbowed angel, he has his right foot upon the sea and his left foot upon the earth. But they're still on fire. So we're at this point here, the subjugation of the nations. Now the next vision is this one in chapter 14. And you'll notice we've got two colours here. Might be hard to see from the back. This light blue and this black. The light blue is the proclamation period that Brother Steve dealt with a couple of weeks ago. That's verses 6 and 7 of Revelation 14. And then we have the vintage of the earth, verses 17 to 20 of this chapter. So it's a 40-year period of divine judgment. That's what this 14th chapter is about. This 40-year period of divine judgment, but it has two parts to it. It talks about the harvest of the earth. Then there's a lull while there is a proclamation to the nations. Then there is another intense period of 30 years of dreadful judgments against the system of Rome. So that's where the vision of chapter 14 fits into the scheme of things. As you work down through that chart, you will see you come down to chapter 20, the serpent bound, and then the New Jerusalem. And then the only one that actually emerges into this period where God is all in all is Revelation 21 verses 1 to 8. So I hope that's helpful in just seeing where this particular chapter sits in the apocalypse. Let's just very quickly review then some of the things that Brother Steve dealt with a couple of weeks ago that are critical to what I have to say. He spoke about the way in which we interpret verse 1. We have 144,000. We know that this is based upon chapter 7, where there were 12 tribes of Israel, each with 12,000 sealed. And to Jews, 1,000 represented a family. In fact, if you go to Judges 6 verse 15, you'll find that Rotherham translates the word 1,000 as family. My 1,000 is the least in Manasseh, said Gideon. So Hebrew looked at 1,000 people and said, well, you had one, and out of him came 1,000, so that's a reference to a family. 144, of course, is attained by squaring 12. 12 is the square root of 144. So using this square root principle here in the green, we don't have any problem interpreting the 144,000, not like the Jehovah's Witnesses and some others. Because all it is a simple reference to the family of Israel. The family of Israel. It's a reference, brothers and sisters, to the Israel of God, of which we are privileged to be part and which we hope to be part of eternally. So here is the company of the redeemed. Now that's a very simple principle, isn't it? You don't have to be a genius to work that out if you've got a key to unlock it. Well, why would we have any problem with the last verse of the chapter? Verse 20. And Brother Steve referred to this briefly 2 weeks ago. We read in the last verse of Revelation 14 that the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress even unto the horse bridles by the space of 1,600 furlongs. Then we'll talk a bit more about the details of what that means later on. But in terms of what this is saying in terms of timing, it's important to use the same principle we used back in verse 1 down here in verse 20. The 1,600 furlongs is not a lineal measurement. Not talking about stepping out, a length, as it were. It is rather a length or period of time. The time in which bloodshed occurs to subdue the nations, and in particular the Catholic nations who are in revolt against Christ. So this is the period of treading out the winepress. Using that same square root principle, we have no problem, because 40 is the square root of 1,600. And we believe it's a clear reference to the 40-year period of divine judgment. Now, this is why I say to you, Revelation 14, I didn't appreciate this until about 20 years ago, but Revelation 14 is absolutely critical in coming to an understanding of the timings that are in front of us. We can actually get a very precise understanding. It's not the only place that helps us in that regard, but it's one of the most important. We're going to talk a bit about that because we need to get these timings right. Now, the other timing that was referred to a couple of weeks ago was the one that occurs in verses 6 and 7. Verse 7 in particular. You'll recall, if you were here, that reference was made to the period of the mid-heaven prophecy or proclamation to the nations after Armageddon. And the proclamation that is made, which goes on, we believe, for 10 years, says this in verse 7. Now think about this, brothers and sisters and young people. If we are there, many of us will actually be the carriers of this message. We will be the messenger. We will go out to all peoples, their rulers, the ordinary common people, so that not one single person on the globe will be able to say, I never heard it. That's the point of a mid-heaven proclamation. It's a proclamation between the rulers in heaven, that is, government people. How much do they keep from the ordinary people in the street? You'd be amazed. Well, they won't be able to keep this message from the ordinary people in the street. The rulers will hear it, and the common people will hear it. And nobody will be able to say, oh, I never heard it. They will be held responsible because they will hear it. Well, what will they hear? Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come. Now, that doesn't sound too bad, does it? I can put up with an hour of torture. It'll be long enough, 1 hour. Doesn't mean 1 hour, does it? It means 30 years. Brother Thomas makes that very plain. In the book Eureka, volume 2, page 361, he says this about this term 1 hour in the Apocalypse. Being then the 12th of a cycle, it is also the hour of that cycle. The small cycle of light called a day, which is the root of all the greater cycles, was divided by the Jews into 12 equal parts, and the night into other 12. Then he makes this comment. This is the only place, and he's actually talking here about Revelation 9:15, this is the only place in the Apocalypse where hour stands for 30 days. It occurs in 7 other places after this. This is where it begins, chapter 14. You got it in chapter 17 and chapter 18. So it becomes quite critical hereafter to understand what the hour represents. He says, in these 7 other places it occurs, but in all these it stands alone and represents a judicial period of 30 years, or the 12th of a time. Now, I'm not going to go into details here tonight. We've done this before. All we want to do is just very quickly review how you arrive at that understanding. Here are the places. Revelation 14:7, 17:12, 18:10, 17 and 19. Where you have this term 1 hour. In 1 hour, her judgment is come. 1 hour is the 12th part of a Jewish day. We work on the principle, don't we, that 1 day represents 1 year in the Bible. And there are various passages there where you can go and you can see. Take this one here, Luke 13:32, where the Lord said to the messengers that came to him from Herod, you go and tell that fox that I'm doing cures today and tomorrow, and the 3rd day I will be perfected. Now, of course, he was not talking about the next 3 days. Whether Herod understood this, I don't know. But Jesus said, you go and tell him, I'll do cures today and tomorrow, and the 3rd day I'll be perfected. He meant 3 years' time. He was 6 months or so into his ministry. He meant the day represents a year. And that's the way, of course, it works through all of those passages there. So we won't go into that. Now then, the 12th part of a year is 1 month. And 1 month is 30 days. Hebrew months had 30 days. So when we're talking about 1 hour, 1 hour is the 12th part of a day. A day represents a year. Take the 12th part of a year. That's 1 month. 1 month has 30 days. Apply the principle again of a day for a year, and you get your 30 years. Now, some people think that's sort of stretching it a bit. That's because, you see, God doesn't want a lot of people to know that. He only wants you and me to know it. Because we want to understand his word. Tell that to someone on the street. They have no idea. But he wants us to understand it. And we can prove that. Now, Steve went into the first proof of that in Revelation 8 verse 1, and he made mention of the 15 years, or almost 15 years, of peace in the empire when Constantine defeated Licinius in 324, and then, of course, 14 and a half years later died in 337. There was silence in heaven by the space of about half an hour. Historical proof that an hour in the apocalypse is 30 years. That's not the only one. The other one is in Revelation chapter 11 verse 13, which talks about the great earthquake of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution began in 1789 and ended in 1819, 30 years. It says in that passage that there was a great earthquake by the space of an hour. So that's the other proof. So you don't have to sort of argue about it. History demonstrates that 1 hour is 30 years. No question about that. Now let's have a look why this is important. Many of you have seen this chart before. It's a little bit like the one you saw before. It starts over here with the return of Christ, the resurrection of the dead. You've got this vertical line here which deals with Armageddon. So we're moving this way. And we come over here to the blue line and we see Christ's universal rule established in the earth. We believe that overall, from the time that the Lord returns to raise the dead to the time that he establishes his universal rule will be 50 years. And this can be broken up into two parts. Obviously, we've been talking about the 40-year period of divine judgment from Armageddon, the crushing of the winepress. That leaves 10 years, of course, for the process of judgment, the preparation of the saints. Their preparation will take some time because there's a lot of things to be done, as we're going to see just a few of them. So we've got the judgment seat, we've got the marriage of the Lamb, and that will see the manifestation of the saints, not openly to the world, but with divine power to bring judgments to bear. Then we have, of course, before Armageddon, the beginning of Elijah's mission to scatter Jewry, and we have the second exodus of Israel, which ends after an exodus of 40 years, just before Christ assumes universal power in the earth. We have, of course, the beginning of the work of the subduing of the Arabs and the smiting and healing of Egypt. Then we have Armageddon, and Armageddon sees the saving of Judah, the third who survived the dreadful events of Armageddon in the land, and they're settled in the land progressively over this period. Gog is buried and the land cleansed and divided. Then we have our mid-heaven proclamation. This occurs immediately after Armageddon and goes on for 10 years. How do we know it's 10 years? Well, we can work that out. Because you see, the message that goes out in verses 6 and 7 is the message that the hour of his judgment is come. So the next thing that's going to happen is the beginning of the hour of judgment. And if the hour is 30 years, this period, then it's obvious that it is preceded by this 10-year period of proclamation. That will see Catholic Europe destroyed in that 30-year period, hour of judgment. Then, of course, we have Britain submitting early in the process, the temple being built, and when Rome is destroyed, the marriage supper of the Lamb will be held. Quite different to the marriage of the Lamb, just like our marriages today. You have the ceremony, maybe here in the hall, and then you have to wait. Well, hours. Can be hours before you get anything to eat. Well, that's quite normal. There's a marriage supper held sometime after the marriage of the Lamb. And then, of course, all nations finally submit to Christ. So then, just taking you back to this initial summary of the chapter. You got an idea of what it's about? This first section here covers the whole 40 years. But it doesn't begin with Armageddon. That comes up here. So, typical of the apocalypse, takes you back there. There's a verse about the patience of the saints in the middle, the fulcrum. Then this section, from verse 13 to 20, takes you back to see how this unfolds. That is the plan of this chapter. Now there's something else I want you to notice. I want you to notice the number of angels in this chapter. You pick that up when you read it through? Well, it helps to highlight it a bit. So you've got a highlighting pencil. Just highlight these angels and see what they do. Okay. You got the two halves of the chapter sorted out? Well, we'll take it in two halves. On this side we have angels of warning and proclamation or pronouncement. On that side we have angels of destruction. So who's the first one? Well, as you'll see, I put verse 15 a little bit above verse 6. That's because the angel of verse 15 precedes the angel of verse 6. So let's just have a look at verse 15. It says, we've read verse 14 about the one like the Son of Man sitting on a white cloud. This is a reference to Christ and the saints. This is a similar vision to the rainbowed angel of chapter 10. And it says in verse 15, and another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So there's a thrusting in of a sickle. So we've called this angel here the harvest angel. He's the angel that precipitates Armageddon. Armageddon is a harvest, as we'll see in a moment. Now the angel of verse 6 is the angel of the mid-heaven proclamation. So after Armageddon, this angel of verse 6 goes out. John says, I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven. And away he goes with the message of the everlasting gospel. He's calling upon the nations to submit. So you've got Armageddon followed by the proclamation. What comes next? Well, you'll notice again I put verse 17 just a little bit above verse 8. You have a look at verse 17. It says, and another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle, but he doesn't use it just yet. He's not going to use it until the angel of verse 18 comes out and tells him to thrust in his sharp sickle. So he's waiting. He's waiting for the opportunity. So this angel of verse 17, he's the vintage angel. He's the one who's going to stamp the winepress. He's going to be the one who brings about the hour of divine judgment. But he's waiting. He's waiting for the outcome of this. And you know what the signal is for this angel to thrust in his sickle and to cut down the grapes to be crushed? Well, it's the message of the angel of verse 8. You have a look at verse 8. Now, if you haven't made this addition to your margin, you should do it. In verse 8. And there followed another angel. In fact, in the Greek, there is a word that has not been translated by the translators. It is the word deuteros. It should read, and there followed another, a second angel. So this is a reference, of course, to the fact that the angel of verse 6 is the first angel in this series of angels. Here is another, a second angel. Now what's his message in verse 8? Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. In other words, his message is that Rome has been destroyed. Now, this is why I say to you, Revelation 14 is very important, because that tells me that Rome as a city, as the centre of Catholicism, is still there 10 years after Armageddon. See, we sort of get in our mind a picture that the great earthquake of Armageddon is going to destroy all the cities of man. Well, it's going to make huge damage. There's no question about that. Rome will suffer as a result of the earthquake. But Catholicism is still based there 10 years later. And Rome goes down the drain 10 years after Armageddon. That's what that is telling me. Because this angel comes out after the proclamation and says, Babylon, Babylon is fallen. He's making an announcement. That is the signal for the angel who has the sickle to begin his work. But you'll notice that something else happens here. In verse 9, there's another angel, a third angel. See what it says in verse 9? And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast in his image and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink. So there's a warning to the adherents of Catholicism. You've seen your city and your Pope go down. Come on. Now is the time to submit to Christ. But most of them won't. And it will be necessary for another 30 years of intense judgment. They will appoint their new Pope. He won't be based in Rome, he'll be based in Central Europe. They'll appoint a new Pope and they'll continue to fight against Christ. Sounds incredible, doesn't it? Until you understand that system. And so it's necessary for the angel of verse 18 to do his work. And the angel of verse 18, it says, another angel came out from the altar, which had power over fire, and cried with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle. This is the one of verse 17. Thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. They've been given opportunity. They saw Armageddon. They had a 10-year proclamation. They saw Rome go down the drain. They had another warning, and they're still rebelling. Their grapes are fully ripe. In fact, that was the case at Armageddon as well. You have a look at the end of verse 15, where it says, thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. That word ripe there is the Greek word sereno. It means to dry up or to wither. In other words, it's almost too late to harvest. It's long overdue. In fact, the Revised Version translates that word ripe at the end of verse 15 as overripe. And I'll tell you something, brothers and sisters and young people. When Armageddon comes, this world is going to be overripe for divine judgment. And no question in my mind about that. We are watching some of the most hideous, filthy wickedness that mankind has ever seen upon earth. And God is restraining himself. He's showing long suffering. I'll talk about this on Friday night to our young people. He's showing long suffering. For what purpose? That we might be in the kingdom. The problem is not all of us account the opportunity as being under salvation. But when the judgment comes, this world will be fully ripe, overripe. And the same will apply when after Armageddon and a proclamation and a destruction of Rome and another proclamation to submit, those who suffer the final 30 years of judgment will be fully deserving of it. They will have been given their opportunity. So there's a message there, isn't there, for today and for tomorrow. So the angel of the winepress of verse 18 will do his work. Now, what we have here at the end of chapter 14 is based upon the harvest season in Israel. We're all pretty familiar with this, I think. The Jewish year doesn't harmonise exactly with ours. Here's our January. The Jewish year, of course, begins with Abib or Nisan, so it begins up here. But you'll see the seasons. That's obviously summer, where we are now. But then, of course, you have the time where you get some early rains, and then you have the winter, then you have the spring, then you have harvest as summer comes on. Well, what we have here is based upon that calendar. You'll see, if you look here, this is Nisan or Abib. They began to harvest the barley. And the barley loaf was used the first sheaf and the barley loaf was used at the time of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Then, 50 days or so later, they began the wheat harvest. So the wheat harvest occurred about here. Then there was a harvest of other things. There was the early figs, the first grapes came about here, some of the summer fruits, but the main vintage was down here in this area, towards the end of the summer. Just like it is here in Australia, we harvest our grapes in sort of February, that period of time, towards the end of summer. So it was in the land of Israel, but in the northern hemisphere, of course. So what we have in the harvest of the earth is a reference to the bringing in of the harvest, the sheaves, in a valley for threshing. Then we have a period of time culminating in the final vintage, when the grapes are brought in and they are crushed. So that's the calendar. So some pictures might just help us to see what this is all about. Here we have the wheat fully ripened, and the sickle has been thrust in, and the sheaves are being gathered, and they're taken into a place on a hillside or a valley somewhere where there was an eminence, and threshing was done, just like it is in the land today by some Arabs still. They don't have the machinery that we've got, so this is how they thresh their wheat. As you can see, there must be an Arab family because there's a half-built home over here. It doesn't have a roof. I don't know why, but they're in the process of building it. But this boy, his father's probably having a siesta, this boy is doing the hard work. Well, it's not really hard, is it? He's standing on this platform and he's got the oxen or the cows pulling it around. But you got the idea? Armageddon, a heap of sheaves in a valley for threshing or judgments. So here we have that scene. So there's our harvest of the earth. So the harvest is Armageddon. That occurs here. When I say the return of Christ down here, that means the return of Christ as far as the nations are concerned. It was 10 years before that, as far as we're concerned. Well, let's just take it from Armageddon. Now, the Catholic system is going to suffer as a result of Armageddon because their allies have gone. So they will suffer. You see this line here? Their power is greatly reduced. But that won't stop them. While Christ is establishing the throne of David in Jerusalem, the Catholic system will be stirring up the nations against him, accusing him of being the Antichrist. And that rebellion will grow and grow until finally, 10 years after Armageddon, Rome is destroyed. Then another message goes out. Look, it's time to submit. They won't. So the Catholic nations of Europe and elsewhere will again, having of course suffered a heavy blow, they will begin to build their power until they'll finally be crushed at the end of this 30-year period of the vintage. But in actual fact, we read in verse 20, it says, that the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horse bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs, or 40 years. So in actual fact, the process of judgment against the Catholic system begins here at Armageddon. And it goes on right through this period until the harvest is absolutely complete. The vintage has been brought in. Now, of course, as you will have noticed, this is all intertwined with what is happening in the redemption of Israel. So we've got Elijah, who brings Israel into the area of Europe at about the time when their revolt is growing again against Christ. And Israel will have to smash their way through Europe. That will be part of the judgments, of the treading out of the winepress of the wrath of God. And this is how they used to do it in ancient times. So we have a man bringing on a donkey the grapes that have been picked in the vineyard. He brings them, you notice this is without the city, to a place where there is a press, and you have a man with, he's got a great job, this man, hasn't he? He just stands there all day and just goes like that, making sure he crushes every grape. Got the idea? Terrific job. The juice of the grape runs out into this little pond here, but it's got a lot of silt in it. The silt settles to the bottom, runs onto the next pond. Then they scoop it up and put it into their jars over here. And then, of course, they've got to shift it from jar to jar and etc. It's a long process. So that's the way that the judgments are going to be poured out upon those who refuse to submit to Christ. The adherents of Catholicism, they're going to be crushed. And Israel will make its way through Europe, and they will crush down the nations who are in revolt against Christ. I want you to come to Psalm 58. In Psalm 58, David is talking about the wicked and their end. He speaks of them in verse 10 as being destroyed with a whirlwind. Verse 9, I should say, with a whirlwind. Verse 10, he says, "The righteous shall rejoice when he seeth the vengeance. He shall wash his feet in the blood of the wicked." Now that's based upon this. This man is washing his feet, as it were, in the blood of the grape. But that, brothers and sisters, is saying something to you and me, isn't it? Because Israel is not going to smash its way through Europe with its own power. Israel has to be taught faith. The power will come from the saints who overshadow them, who work with Elijah, and many of the saints will be there in that work to ensure that the second exodus of Israel is brought to fruition with a purified people. So this is a reference to you and me, not just to Israel. The righteous shall rejoice when he seeth the vengeance. You know, we live in a strange world, don't we? Australia, or much of Australia, is up in arms about the mandatory death sentence on drug traffickers in Singapore. And there are all sorts of things going on. The media, of course, is responsible for a lot of the hullabaloo. All sorts of things going on, however, because a young man broke the law in Singapore carrying 450 grams of heroin, which probably would have killed at least some people, heroin addicts, and they die like flies, particularly in Melbourne. And yet the nation, in fact part of the world, the lefty part of the world, they're up in arms. Fancy putting a man to death on the end of a rope. I'll make no comment about my views on that. But, brothers and sisters and young people, he only received what he was due to receive, the vengeance for drug traffickers. You know, when these judgments are played out, there are literally going to be hundreds of thousands of Christadelphians who never knew the name Christadelphian as we know it, who will be there to see the vengeance because their husbands and their wives and their children and their relatives and their brethren and sisters were butchered by this system, which is still in revolt against God and against his Son. And I'll tell you, you won't see something in that day. You won't see something that you see today. because there won't be newspapers and radios and television stations to proclaim the rights of man. There'll only be people who will proclaim the rights of God. And you and I hope to be amongst them. So when we read Revelation chapter 14, brothers and sisters and young people, let us read it in the way we should read it. The just and righteous judgments of God. The treading out of a winepress for the space of 40 years. You know what it said when it says at the end of that chapter, to the horse bridles, the blood came out to the horse bridles. Well, the horse in the Apocalypse is used of the Roman Empire in the earlier chapters, isn't it? And it says this was done without the city. In other words, the judgments which begin against Rome are extended to all the Catholic nations who support him, wherever they might be upon the face of the earth. And blood comes out even unto the horse bridles. That's pretty deep if you took it literally. But you don't take it literally, you take it symbolically. It's simply a reference to the fact that this bloodshed goes on for 40 years against the system of Rome, symbolised by the horse. And of course the horse is also used in the prophecies in relation to the power of the nations that Israel is going to break. So we see the vengeance of God and the washing of the feet of some in the blood of the wicked. I take no pleasure in that, brothers and sisters, in terms of the terrible destruction and the heartache. But I tell you what I'll take pleasure in, just as you will take pleasure in it. You will take pleasure in seeing the vindication of the righteousness of God and the destruction of every semblance of wickedness and rebellion which so corrupts the earth that we live in today.